So, it's been a while again, toiling away on writing code as usual. My previous video was all about writing a baseline on how combat mechanics could work, but it was all very theoretical. This time I wanted to work on movement, since it's another core feature that's needed for the game to be functional. I already had ideas on wanting to implement some form of grid-based movement, but nothing beyond that. The first thing to do in a case like this is research. Plenty of other games have already done this, so it would be wise to try them out to understand what works, and what would contextually fit whatever you're trying to go for. I do have some baseline rules though. I wanted the movement to be relatively easy to implement, so no hexagonal grids, square is the only choice. The game will be taking place in smaller, more contained building-like structures anyway, which in real life are usually rectangular. Godot was actually quite convenient here, as it had square-based tiling systems for both visualization and pathfinding, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. Point is, squares. The second rule, despite movement being limited to squares, I want the coverable distance to be realistic enough. Think of it from the perspective on where I am right now. If you can only move horizontally and vertically, and you have a set amount of distance you're allowed to move, the overall shape would end up becoming a diamond. If you can move diagonally at the same cost, then it would become a square, and diagonal movement would become overpowered due to moving 2 tiles at the cost of 1. Third rule. Stealth would be possible within the given constraints, but not needed to be successful. I love stealth games, but one thing that slightly irks me is when there is a game that pretty much wants you to focus in one particular style. It might allow you to go loud shooting at everything, or as quiet as possible, but you have to focus on that playstyle at all times to get the most out of their scoring systems. Basically, I want to make a game where your tactical approach has to be more flexible, more about preparing ambushes, being able to switch between being stealthy or offensive on the fly. And finally, fourth rule for now, I want turns to be more focused on being able to take your time and think your moves through. You have a turn with a set amount of movement distance and a set number of actions that you get to use in a turn. You decide how to use them, and then the enemies do the same on their turn. I want to avoid a situation where you move or do an action once and then all enemies do the same. I just don't jive with that kind of approach. I'll still look at a few examples of these just in case though. With that in mind, here's the list of games that I decided to check through to learn more about. I've ordered them all worst to best on how inspired I got by them. However, I'll be tossing away the first 2 immediately. In terms of how their movement was implemented, I felt mild. My problem was that I already knew in advance that these games are following the move once, everyone else moves once style of turn mechanics. But really, I just hated how both of these games approached with their tutorials. They dragged on for way too long to explain things that you could have just done through gameplay. Pin that to the things that I should keep in mind for the future. XCOM. There's been a bit of time since the last game in the series was released, but all the games have been really solid. Movement here is relatively simple. You get 2 points for each character during your turn. The first point is exclusively for movement. The second point you get to decide if you want to move even further, or perform an action like shooting at enemies. And some actions require both points. And overall, I don't think I want to follow this because you have to commit to your movement decision, and if it turns out there is an enemy around the corner, your teammate is screwed. My primary focus is to just have one playable character at a time be a viable choice, and XCOM's movement is exclusively designed for squads. However, I did wonder on whether or not squad-based gameplay can be a functional idea for my game. I'll pin that to the idea list as a post-release expansion to consider working on, for people who might end up way too invested in the base game. Metal Gear Acid. I picked this game up purely because I was curious. I love the entire Metal Gear series, but both Acid games were ones that I never had any contact with. My opinion? Could have been worse. I didn't hate it, but I'm not exactly the biggest fan on its card system approach for our actions, having to rely on luck to get the right things to move forward. But man, can it get annoying to grind for the rare cards that actually provide interesting effects. At the very least, the UI experience is really great though. There's no information overload, and and the instructions needed are quite clear, which makes this a good reference point to keep in mind. Oh wait, the movement. Basically, you get a set number of actions to use your cards for movement or their ability. Every card also has a cost associated. The more cards you use, the more your cost goes up, and that determines the turn order who gets the next turn. An interesting concept that I'm surprised no one has made any other games about, but something that I ultimately decided that I didn't want to follow. Finally, Invisible Ink. Man, was I surprised with this one and fell in love with it. All the movement here? It's mine now. I made this. No, really, almost everything that this game does with its movement is using ideas that I was originally thinking about. Square-based grids allows for diagonal movement, but makes it so that every movement swaps between 1 and 2 points, which makes the entire coverable distance much closer to a circle. Stealth implementation is absolutely great. You're not limited to just being able to move around tiles like a Metal Gear Acid, but can also automatically take cover behind objects, affecting enemy vision. Basically, lots of ideas for enemy AI in the future. And finally, you have all the time in the world to think through your decisions on where to move, to take things one step at a time. Really, the only issue that I have with this game's mechanics are purely stealth focused with 0 ways for combat, but that's a problem that I can iron out myself with such a solid foundation. Now then, inspirations have inspired. What's next? Implementing the movement, right? Nope, we first need a level to visualize. Can't exactly move around if you have nothing to click on. Fortunately, this is a lot easier to implement than it first seems. Godot already has built-in solutions to display and control grid-based content, 3D visuals with grid maps, and movement logic with an A-star class. I won't delve too deep into this, but here's the basic summary. Every basic tile represents an area that you can move on. If there is no tile in place, it gets filled with a wall tile when next to an empty tile. All tiles refer to a set of texture images, basic visuals and normal maps so that any lighting applied on the tile would look more realistic. Also, in order to not make the visuals too repetitive, the tiles have been split into 16 subdivisions that refer to different parts of the texture, making them cover more space. And the best part of all this, the materials on these tiles are quite easy to change, so they can be swapped as needed whenever going to new levels. Beautiful. Now, let's apply all of that and load in a level so that we know where... Godot? What is that? Well, it's probably going to take years for these white dots to be fixed. Just add a black fog and those dots will turn black and blend in with the rest of the visuals. It's fine for now, I guess. But anyway, visuals are available and we have an idea on where we want to be able to move. This can be divided into 3 subsections. Understanding where the player's mouse is placed on to indicate where you want to move, generating a valid path to move from your current position to the target, and then actually moving there. Since we're dealing with a 3D world, raycasting is pretty much mandatory to translate mouse position to tile position. A raycast is just a straight line being shot from the rotation and position of the camera onto anything that has collisions enabled. We can have an invisible square cover the entire playable area, act as that collision spot, and with some computer magic, get floating point numbers on the location the mouse is pointing to. Floor them into integers and you've got your true grid positions. For the whole figuring out the path between 2 tiles, the A-star function comes into play, which Godot conveniently has available as a built-in tool. All this does is automatically figure out the most efficient path between whatever 2 positions you feed into it. You have to initialize it yourself though, meaning manually connecting every tile to every spot that you can go to. In my case, for every square, all the surrounding 8 squares that don't have any walls blocking them. The only minor annoyance that I have with it is that all of your tiles need to be stored as long type IDs. You can't directly ask for a path between grid positions, but you can always just make a separate container class that manually keeps track of both of these values. Finally, moving from one position to another is pretty trivial, and you can implement that however you want. The A-star pathing method gives an array of ID values that you can convert into tile positions and then move the character from one tile to another, one by one. There are definitely ways to make the movement more realistic, but as long as you have the array of tiles, you'll be fine. Okay, cool. So basic movement is functional and I can click around with my mouse to move the character. There's just one problem. You see, I like to play games on a controller. I really like to play games on a controller, to the point where I'm willing to shell out way too much money for a glorified controller that is supposed to have its sticks replaceable, yet they're sold out everywhere. And last time I checked, there aren't exactly that many games that have solved making a control scheme for a turn-based tactics game that would be fun on a controller. Like, Jupiter Hell kind of has something that works, although feels a bit weird, and Metal Gear Acid was designed for the PSP with no mouse, so it had to do something. These were the only games that kind of fulfilled the criteria on what I was looking for. Everything else either just didn't have anything or had a subpar experience. So, here's my original interpretation on how to solve this. 1. Have the camera swappable between a top-down and third-person perspective. You'll be moving with the left stick and looking around with the right stick. 2. Have the movement imitate Metal Gear Solid 2, because it's my favorite game and I want to make my coding process more miserable than it needs to be. And 3. Address some unique problems that come with diagonal movement in this configuration, also porting them over to mouse controls to keep it consistent. The camera swapping thing was mostly trivial for me, since I already mentioned having made a virtual camera system in the previous video, one that allows the camera to switch between locations by copying the position and rotation of those points, the same thing you're seeing in these videos on how the camera's moving about. The bigger technical problem is how camera controls are supposed to work between the two modes and control schemes, but even that's really not that big of an issue, just some form of boolean to determine if it's in third person mode, and if so, have the controls on both keyboard and mouse plus controller imitate how modern games work. Now, copying MGS2 movement, I had recollections that despite being rather arcade-like by modern day control standards, the movement still felt somewhat realistic. You don't instantly move in a direction, it takes time, almost as if you have some weight on you. There is also a certain amount of degrees that the character has to be close to in order to start moving forward, to prevent situations where you start moving backwards to your actual direction. Once all that was figured out, implementing it was quite easy. The only deviation that I made is that you move at a slower speed when not fully facing towards your target direction, just so that accidentally moving to the wrong tile is less likely. Finally, diagonal movement. If you've noticed, we're dealing with a square grid, and the mouse implementation allows you to move diagonally. Doing the same thing as is on a controller is basically impossible. You will always end up going to one of the side squares first and waste a point moving to the target. I made two solutions that remove any possibility of this happening though. The first is that you don't immediately enter a new tile when walking directly on it. Instead, a circle distance is drawn relative to the last position. The line overlaps all surrounding squares, and only after you cross it will the game recognize that you've entered a new square. Even with that though, a player can still mess up movement by accident, so the second solution is adding diagonal correction. The game keeps track on whether you moved horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. If you move horizontally and then vertically, or vice versa, the game interprets this as you having wanted to move diagonally, and then similarly to Invisible Ink, checks if it allows this movement for free or takes an extra point. As mentioned, this will also apply for mouse movement. Homestretch, we're almost done. The last thing that I wanted to do for now is to add thinner walls, which allow for more realistic room representation, No need for entire tiles of space to be left uncovered. This part was a bit of a nuisance for me because I couldn't figure out a good way to visualize them, so what I ended up doing was adding 3 more grid maps for our horizontal and vertical tiles, as well as their connection points. On the logic end, whenever a wall is added, the system checks the surrounding area of tiles and removes any A-star connections so that you can't move through the wall. I also added a placeholder item that is capable of blocking movement, but the idea of this is to be in some sort of furniture or things that can be interacted with. And we're done. I definitely skipped through some details on stuff I've done, like how the performance is straight garbage right now on a Steam Deck, but that stuff is for when all the fundamentals are ready and I'm getting to optimization. I just wanted to spend less time on the videos so that I can move to the next step, which in this case is going to be level generation. I have no idea where to even start with this, but thanks to all the stuff done here by now, it seems like the most sensible thing to pick out and work on now. I'll also probably make some form of proper visualizer on how far you're allowed to walk. I need to make that for a few other things anyway. And then once that's done, I can start working with enemy AI. So, back to work. Until next time, again,